Welcome to Introduction to Aerodynamic Objects Tutorial 1. Welcome to wind. And in this you're going to make some wind and understand how to visualize it with arrows and particles. So what we're going to do is create a wind model by using a fluid zone in a scene. Then we're going to adjust wind speed, direction and angle. And then we're going to look at some different visualization tools. Then we're going to have a look at turbulence and how to adjust that to see what that does. And then if you get all the way through to the end, you should be able to use a point particle object to write your name in smoke. So this is a diagram really of what we're going to cover in the tutorial. And the main concept here really is that the fluid zone at the top there is the wind model. So in there defines the speed, direction, turbulence of the wind. And that's kind of your mathematical model of the wind. And then because wind is actually quite hard to see, what we have is a number of different visualization tools to help you or the player or the user understand what's going on with the wind. So we've got flow field particles. So these are unity particles which we can view in the fluid zone, see which way the wind is blowing. And then we have flow field arrows. So these are arrows distributed throughout the fluid zone which tell you which direction the wind is blowing in. And then lastly we have flow point particles, and this is a bit like a smoke wand where you place this somewhere in the flow and there will be smoke coming out of that point blowing in the wind. Okay, so I've just started a new scene in Unity. I followed the steps in tutorial 0 in terms of importing Unity and the Unity input system, so I've got that all set up, so I'm ready to build something with aerodynamic objects. So let's familiarize ourselves with the project. So if you've imported aerodynamic objects, you'll see a structure something like this in your project window. So you've got assets and then AO, and if you expand that down, you have got core and then you've got tutorials, which is what we want. And we want the introduction to aerodynamic objects tutorials. And within that folder, you can see we've got some prefabs and we've got some materials. What I've done is created a new directory here called My Tutorials, and that's where I'm going to put my kind of work in progress tutorials. And if you're following this and doing this, I suggest you create a new directory which you can create your scene in. So we've created a scene, it's untitled. What I'm going to do is File, Save As, and I'm going to save it in that directory I just created. So My Tutorials, and let's call it Tutorial 1 Work in Progress. There we go. It's always worth checking at the top there that you've named it correctly. It's easy to get scene names muddled up, so check up there. Okay, great. So let's build something. So the first thing we're going to do is put a person in our scene, and that's going to give us some scale, and he's going to be holding up a particle smoke generator as well. So if we're looking in prefabs, you should find something called the Aeroman figure, and this Aeroman figure features in many of the tutorials, and he gets to fly all sorts of interesting things in later tutorials. So let's drag him into the scene. There we are. So it's worth just checking the coordinate systems. So we've got the compass icon up here, or compass gizmo. So we've got Z forward, Y up, X to the right, and we're just checking the man that we've put in. He's facing forward in the Z direction, and then X is to the right and Y is up. And when we put things in the world, we're always going to be using that orientation, whether it's an aircraft or a block or whatever. In the Z is always forward, X is to the right and Y is up, and that helps no end in sorting out issues with coordinate systems. Okay, so the other thing we're going to do is drop in some prefabbed cameras. These kind of work out the box. They'll be used for all the tutorials. The one we're going to use in this tutorial is the orbit camera, which is set to by default. You don't really have to do anything with those. But the main thing now is if we press play, we'll jump to the game view, and we can use the left mouse button to move around, or the wheelie mouse button in the middle to move in and out. Okay, let's create some wind. First off, let's create an empty game object, and I'm going to call it my flow fields. You can call it whatever you like. And in this tutorial, to keep things straightforward, everything is going to be anchored at 0, 0, 0. So when you create your object, check that its position is 0, 0, 0, and if it's not, put it at 0. Okay, if you right click on that, context menu, aerodynamic objects, and now we're going to create a fluid zone, which is our mathematical model of the wind. And I can see immediately that's put it in as an offset, and we want to make sure that's anchored on 0, 0, 0 again. So if you go up to 3 dots icon, reset property position, that'll jump it to there, and now we've got it nicely centered where our man is standing. Okay, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to set up an inspector tab specifically for the fluid zone, because we're going to want to change these properties lots of times, and it's really handy if we can get at it exactly when we want it. So if you go to 3 dots icon up here and do add tab inspector, and what we're going to do is fluid zone up there, and we're going to lock it to the fluid zone, and then we're going to drag it down here. It takes a little bit of practice, and we're going to put it there, and that means it's always available when we want to change things in our fluid zone. Okay, so we've got some fluid in there. Let's press play, see what happens. Okay, so actually nothing happens. Well, underneath there in the maths world, there's loads of maths going on in terms of wind blowing through the space around the man. Put the gizmos on, you can see our box that he's standing in. There's wind rushing through there, but we can't see it because wind is invisible. So what we need to do now is put in some visualization tools to help us see the wind. And the first thing we're going to do is put in some point particles. So this is like having a smoke wand in a flow where you just create smoke and the wind blows the smoke away from where you're creating it. So if you right click in some empty space and go to Aerodynamic Objects, and what we want is flow point particles. And it's got a particle system on it, which is just Unity's recognized straight away. And what we want to do is move it to the aeroman's hand. So I'm going to go into ortho mode so I can see what I'm doing. Drag it across, drag it up, look at it from the front, and so now that particle system is attached to aeroman's hand. Okay, great. So, well, actually, before we move on, let's create a separate inspector for this one. So we're going to do the same thing again. Add tab, inspector, flow point particles, lock it to that, and then let's drag that down to here. Okay, so we've got both of those there, and we can change them when we want to. Great, let's play, see what happens. I can turn off gizmos because we don't need those. And there we got it. We've got the man, he's got some smoke wand in his hand, and you can now see the wind in terms of it's blowing backwards. The wind's blowing in his face and blowing backwards. Okay, so we're in our fluid zone, so if we want to change the wind model, we can increase the wind speed, therefore it's going faster. We can change the direction, so we can make the wind go down, we can make the wind go up, and so on. So now, there we have it, we can see the wind. But, as you can imagine, there's a lot going on. If we turn gizmos back on, and go to our flow field, we can see that our box there, we're only visualizing the wind on a little part of the flow. Our wind model covers the whole thing. So what we want to do now is better see the flow in the whole box. And what we're going to do is add some flow field arrows that show you the wind direction throughout the box. So, clicking on my flow field, and then I'm going to right click to get to the context menu, Aerodynamic Objects, and this time we want flow field arrows. As before, let's create a separate tab for these. So an inspector tab, and it's flow field arrows, and we're going to lock it to that, and I'm going to drag them down to, let's put them there. Doesn't matter where you put them, you just need somewhere where you can see them. Okay, and the key thing here is that when you add these flow field arrows, they actually need to subscribe to a fluid zone. So these arrows need to pick up their information from somewhere. And so what we have, if we look down here, fluid zones, list is empty. If we add one fluid zone to that, and what we're going to do is drag in the fluid zone we created. And that means that these flow field arrows subscribe to that fluid zone, so they'll show what's going on from there. You can add many fluid zones if you want in terms of advanced usage, so you may have a fluid zone attached to maybe a helicopter with a wake in it, so you may want these arrows to show what the wake underneath the helicopter is doing. For now, we've just got a one fluid zone and we're directly attached to that. Okay, so what are we doing? It's going to create 3 by 3 by 3 arrows. And we've got some size controls and so on. Let's see what that does. Okay. So we've got some arrows. They're not exactly inside the box. So what's happened there is when we created the arrows, Unity didn't create them on the origin, so they're slightly offset. So what I'm going to do is go back to our flow field arrows, and we'll look on here, it's not at 0, 0, 0. So let's reset property position, and they are now located on the origin. Let's have another go. There we go, that's better. So we've got 3 arrows in each direction, and we've still got the smoke wand with the showing the flow there, and then we've got our dancing arrows showing what's going on with the turbulence. And just to verify things like azimuth and elevation, if we go to the scene view and let's look at it from the X direction. So this is the man facing forwards. If you notice, the default wind direction is essentially into the man's face. So that 0 azimuth is wind effectively coming from the north, blowing straight into the person. And I'm going to turn turbulence off so we can see what's going on a bit more clearly. Let's change the elevation angle of the wind, and there we can see uniformly what the flow direction is doing. And then if we look at it from the top, clicking on the Y there, if we look at azimuth, so the direction of the wind, so that's the direction coming from the right, and now the flow is coming from the left. You can change the format of these arrows as you see wish, so you can make them bigger or smaller, you can make them more sensitive, and then there's some other features here in terms of visual range. If you've got a lot of arrows in your scene, what you can do is you can set a focus point to the thing you're looking at, and what it does is it fades out the arrows away from that focus, so it allows you to focus on what you want to look at. So there's a sailing boat demo where actually you want to see the local wind around the boat as it moves around, so in that case you'd use this visual range tool for that. Great, so that's flow field arrows. What we're now going to look at is if you seed the whole volume with particles, and then we're going to investigate the effects of turbulence and how you can see that with these particles. So as before, we are going to add another visualization tool. So I've selected my flow field, I've right clicked on it, I've gone down to AerodynamicObjects, and this time I'm going to add in flow field particles. And as soon as I do that, Unity fires up its particle visualization thing. It's slightly annoying after a while, so you can just press stop and that gets rid of it, and we'll see it when it starts playing. So as before, we want to make sure it's centered in the middle of our scene, so we are going to do reset property position. So therefore, it's great, we can see it's properly aligned, and we're going to do the thing where we are going to create a new tab, add tab, inspector, flow field particles, and we're going to lock it to that, and then we can drag that down to here, and let's put that there. So we've got our fluid zone here, which is our mathematical model. We have got our flow field arrows, so showing the direction throughout the volume. We've got our smoke particles from the aeroman's hand, and then we have at the end here our flow field particles. So what I'm going to do is actually turn off the arrows. Oops, turn off the arrows and the point particles, so we can just look at the flow field particles. Okay, let's give that a try. Okay, and we do that and nothing happens, and that is because I have not subscribed the flow particles to anything. So if we look on here, as with the arrows, these tools need to know which fluid zones that they're receiving their information from. So if we do create an element, and then if we drag in the fluid zone that we created earlier, so now these particles know to read the flow data from the fluid zone. So this time if we press play, something should happen. Okay, so we got some particles. I'm going to turn off the turbulence to start off with to make it a bit simpler. And there we go. We're looking straight at the man, and we've got a bit of kind of a star field effect going on there. So I'm going to go to the scene view, and I'm going to look at it from the X direction before and take off perspective mode. So now we can see our man with the flows coming to it. Something worth knowing about these, for economy reasons, these are single particles with trails on. When we had the point particles, there were actually many particles spawned one after the other. So this, whilst there seems to be a lot going on in here, these are just single particles with trails on. So you can get away with simulating a good few thousand particles, depending on your power of your machine, with decent frame rate. So let's look at the what we did before. Elevation, particles go down, up and down, and same again. We look at it from top. We can see flow comes from the side, and so on. Okay, that's all as expected. Let's go back to the side view, and now let's change some of the parameters on this. So I tell you what, let's make the if we make the particles last for longer, what it means is that these streak lines go a bit longer, and I'm going to make them slightly bigger. Okay, that's too big. That's okay, we're spawning 100 a second. And what if I now add in some turbulence? You start to see some fairly interesting effects. And what I'm going to do start off with is turn the time off, and I'm going to set the turbulent length scale to 10, and I'm going to do turbulence magnitude of 0.5. So there we are, we've got some sort of wavy sort of wind going on in there. If I increase the turbulence magnitude, so at 1 basically the flow can just about come back on itself, but if you increase it beyond that, the flow can then start sort of going around in circles. So now if we push the value up to, let's just leave it at that. So what we've got now is the wind is coming in, but it can change direction. And it can change direction by more than its initial velocity, so actually the wind is speeded up a little bit depending on what the turbulence values are. Okay, and then this turbulence length scale, what this does is it changes kind of how quickly the turbulence changes over space. So if I set it to a low value, the turbulence changes relatively gradually over space, and if I set it to a high value, the turbulence changes quickly over space. So this kind of length scale thing, depending if you want your turbulence really bobbly and lots of different things happening, you can increase the length scale or you can decrease it for kind of smoother turbulence. I'm going to put it back at 10. The other thing we want to look at is, in fact, what I'm going to do is actually put that to 0 so they're going straight, but I'm now going to vary the time. So what you have now is that the flow is going all in the same direction. It's synchronized, but it's changing in time. And you don't need a very high value for this one to get interesting behaviors happening. And if I turn the turbulence magnitude down a little bit, you can get some flow that sort of gently changes direction with time. And let's put it all together and turbulence scale, let's, okay, 10. And then if we look at that sideways on, you can see we've got a lovely big box of turbulence. It's all based on Perlin noise, so it's very efficient way of generating turbulence compared to methods in aerodynamics. And if you look carefully, there is some symmetry to it there, and that's due to the way the Perlin noise is generated. So depending on how random you want it, you can set it up in different ways. The other thing we can do when we've got that, actually you can turn off particle trails, and it makes you realize how useful particle trails are, because without that it just looks like angry bees, and it's very, very hard to see what the flow's doing at all. So let's turn those back on. And you can of course change the rate of spawning of particles, so we can have more particles and that'll fill it out, or the same number of particles we can make them last for longer, and that'll fill it out too. Okay, so you can play with turbulence for ages. I'm going to leave that there, and to finish up we're going to have some fun by seeing if we can write our name or write messages in turbulent wind. So let's stop that, and what we're going to do is turn on the point particles. I'm going to turn off the flow field particles. So now if we're looking on here, we've got our fluid zone and we've got our flow point particles, and let's have a go at see if we can do some writing. Press play on that. I'm going to do it in the scene view, and I'm going to look at it from the X direction. I'm going to zoom in a bit, and I'm going to turn turbulence off to start off with, and if I select flow point particles, I can turn gizmos off, and I can drag this, click on this red box, and I can drag it. So you can have a go at writing things. That's kind of okay. Tell you what, what I would like is I'm going to make the time scale a bit slower, and I'm going to reduce the turbulence a little bit, but I'm going to make it a bit more bobbly over space. We're on flow point particles. I'm not going to be, let's emit individual particles, and I'm going to make them slightly bigger, and we can have a go at doing some writing. So let's do our hello world again. Hello world. Okay, let's have more particles. I go more particles. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's turn our turbulence on. So now we can do it, and you get some cool arrival type effects. All seen before, but this is real aerodynamics in here, so if you were flying through that, you would know what was going on. So now looking at head on, so same thing, we can have some fun by writing hello world, and that is actually drifting backwards in space there. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this Welcome to Wind tutorial, and I guess the key learning points here are that to create wind in aerodynamic objects, you use a fluid zone object, and that is your wind model. So that's your mathematical model, the wind, and then in that model you can change wind speed and direction, and you can change turbulence. But as we saw at the beginning, you can't see wind, so you need visualization tools to be able to understand what the wind is doing. So we've seen 3 different visualization tools. We started off with the flow point particles. So that's your kind of smoke wand, where you can see smoke coming from a point in space. Then we looked at flow field arrows, which is fills the volume of the fluid zone with arrows that move according to what the mathematical model of the wind is. And then finally we saw flow field particles, where you can fill the volume with particles, and that's particularly useful if you want to visualize what turbulent flow is doing. Okay, I hope that was useful. In our next tutorial, tutorial 2, we are going to start building actual objects that respond to wind. So when you apply winds, they get forces on them and they start moving around. So we can start generating interesting behaviors of objects in wind.